Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first session of the 2025-26 academic year of our Greenberg Bladder Cancer Institute Grand Rounds. On behalf of our entire Greenberg Bladder Cancer Institute team, we're very grateful that you have chosen to join us here today. I'm going to lead off with just a couple of housekeeping updates. Some are organizational, some logistical, and then some just to point out some of the resources available through the Institute to our viewers and patients. The first is a logistical update. As you'll notice, David McConkey, who had been our director for the last 9 years and typically led these sessions, is not leading this session today. And that's because Dr. McConkey has actually moved on to the University of Rochester to take an opportunity there and in the role of vice chair of research in their Department of Urology. This is an incredible opportunity for Dr. McConkey, and we wish him the best. It's certainly a loss for us. We cannot thank him enough for his leadership in the 9 years of bringing our institute to where it is today, and we would not be here without his efforts, and we thank him for all of that. And certainly wish him the best, and we'll continue to collaborate and now have friends up in upstate New York. So we wish Dr. McConkey the best in this new chapter in his life and career. And with that organizational change, I can report to you that one of the reasons that I'm leading this particular session, but also I've been here on different opportunities in the past to speak to you, but myself and Max Cates, one of our beloved and esteemed urologists who you've seen on other sessions, have the distinct honor of being named the co-directors of the Greenberg Bladder Cancer Institute, and that was effective July 1st. So we're looking forward to this sort of new chapter and this new opportunity to lead this incredible organization. More will be following in sort of subsequent communications and things, but that's one of the logistical updates that I wanted to share with the group today. From a kind of housekeeping institute, for more information about the Institute, our activities, our services, our webinars, our patient advocacy and informational materials, you can always simply Google Greenberg Bladder Cancer Institute. I actually tried it today. It's the first thing that pops up. We try to keep it up to date with as much information as possible that's current, so it's always a resource that's there for you. We are also expanding our educational offerings, including our growing collection of programming. For instance, our women's program, which is led by Dr. Armin Smith and Dr. Jeannie Hoffman-Censits, who we'll hear a little later today, as well as program members Pamela Getz and Stephanie Cooper Greenberg. This particular program is specifically tailored around the experiences of women with bladder cancer, and please see our website for our next virtual women's group that is held with that program. Additionally, we have also been working with our clinical providers to assure that our GBCI has sort of a front door access for our patients and is easy to access. We have 2 specific email addresses for the Institute. The first is all sort of one word, bladdercancer@jhmi.edu. And then the second, which is specific to our upper tract urothelial carcinoma patients, is utuc@jhmi.edu. So those 2 email addresses, we do monitor them, and we try to answer them as quickly as possible, but those are ways to kind of get in the door as quickly as possible. So please consider those a resource for our patients and families. And then I would encourage you to visit our site just to keep updated. We put our newsletter there. We also will post a portfolio of our many previously held Grand Round sessions there. So if you catch today's and you think that the flavor of sort of what you hear today is good and you'd like to learn more about some of our past presentations, those are archived there for everyone's use. As far as a new resource, we have a series of smart insights and important questions for patients that we believe all patients and their families can benefit from as they embark their own cancer journey, and that is also contained within our GBCI website. So again, another resource for everyone there as well. And we try to keep this information up to date and certainly welcome and solicit your feedback. We're only one email away, and that's bladdercancer@jhmi.edu, as I mentioned earlier. So that's it for the updates for today. With that taken care of, I'm incredibly grateful to kick off this new academic year with what is one of our most consistently asked questions on our website and through our webinars from our patients and families, and that is clinical trial updates, discoveries for better outcomes. Um, I hope you allow me this chance right now just to give a brief introductory to our co-hosts today for this talk. The first is my good friend and esteemed colleague, Dr. Jeannie Hoffman-Censits. She's an associate professor of oncology here at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. She's the director of the upper tract urothelial cancer multidisciplinary clinic, as well as the co-leader of the women's bladder cancer program within the Greenberg Bladder Cancer Institute. She's a genitourinary oncology expert in Baltimore and Washington, D.C., caring for patients with urothelial cancers of the bladder and upper tract. She received her undergraduate degree in neuroscience from Trinity College, her medical degree from the Sidney Kimmel Medical College of Thomas Jefferson University, completed a residency at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital, and then her fellowship in hematology oncology at Temple University Medical Center. And she joined the Johns Hopkins faculty and has been a key member of our Greenberg Bladder Cancer Institute since 2018. Her research interests focus on urothelial cancers, specifically urothelial cancer subtypes, rare subtypes, and developing therapies for those, as well as developing therapeutic approaches for women with urothelial cancer and establishing new treatments for bladder and upper tract urothelial cancers. So we're very happy to have Dr. Jeannie Hoffman-Censits with us today. As for myself, I'm not sure I can match a lot of that in terms of the pedigree and background of Dr. Hoffman-Censits, but I am also a bladder cancer expert. I see patients with all diseases, all stages of diseases, but I also have a unique expertise in early stage disease and non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, and work very closely with our urology, radiation oncology, pathology colleagues in terms of clinical and translational work in that particular area. I'm originally a Midwesterner. I grew up in Indiana. I got my degree from Notre Dame. I then went on to medical school at Indiana University. I did my internship at Emory and then my internal medicine residency at Duke, and then my fellowship training back in Indiana, where I was on faculty there for about 7.5 years at Indiana University School of Medicine. And then I moved here to Johns Hopkins in 2014 at that time to become part of the bladder cancer, the growing bladder cancer enterprise across all of the specialties. I've had a great time here and continue to do so, and it's a pleasure to be at Johns Hopkins. So that's just a little bit about myself. We are also exceptionally grateful to Stephanie Cooper Greenberg, who will be joining us today for the question and answer session. As co-founder of our institute, along with her husband, Erwin, Stephanie is a tireless advocate for bladder cancer patients and their families. In addition to her important work in bladder cancer, Stephanie also serves Johns Hopkins on several boards, from the Children's Center to the Center for Innovative Medicine, and also serves on the State Council on Cancer Control. Myself and Dr. Hoffman are going to speak for the first part of this meeting. We'll be having a conversation about some clinical trials, updates from the past year, since we've spoken on this before, as well as some things that are coming up. And also just a little bit, again, about the context of clinical trials, thinking about it in terms of, why and how would a patient want to be part of a clinical trial. I would ask for folks to submit questions along the way via the Q&A through the chat session. And then after the conversation, we'll have ample time for group discussion. And at that time, Stephanie Cooper Greenberg will come back in and sort of moderate that Q&A session as well. So I think with that in mind, myself and Dr. Hoffman-Censits will kick off this particular grand round. So Jeannie, thanks for joining us and finding time. I should point out also before we get started that Dr. Hoffman-Censits is joining us from off-site and may have some times where she has to go off camera just due to some competing things that are happening there, but she's going to be talking with us the whole time. So if you do see the camera blank out, that's probably not a technical difficulty, and we're going to continue the conversation through. So thanks so much, Jeannie, for joining us for this particular session. And with that in mind, I wonder if you might be able to kind of start our conversation about clinical trials in terms of In the last year, it's been quite a year for urothelial cancer. What do you think, from our audience and our patients and families, um, what are you most excited about? What are some of the things, some of the new studies that have kind of, read out? And what are some things that, we think we really want to share with them that we're excited about?
Sure. I mean, that's a lot of questions to start out with, Noah. First of all, hi, good to see you.
Yes.
We talk a lot, but don't see each other on screen too much. I think there's so much to talk about. For me, always, I mean, because as I see more patients that have locally advanced and metastatic disease. I think the fact that really the disease and the um, outcomes for patients today is just so much different than even when I came here in 2018. And when we first met, like I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago, um, the 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 paradigm shift is just so unbelievable in that our frontline treatment for patients with advanced disease has really changed, and outcomes expectations are quite different. So for a long time, we used, and we still use, to some extent, a chemotherapy, called platinum, either cisplatin or carboplatin, which is tough for our patient population. It tends to be older and have other medical issues, and with the hope that that can control advanced cancer. And to some extent, we would get some reasonable outcomes, but most of the time, um, uh, patients' cancers would recur and we would be moving on to other therapies. In past couple of years, there were multiple different trials done with a combination of agents, one called infertumab, another called pembrolizumab. So pembrolizumab is immunotherapy, and immunotherapy has we're using it in many different settings. I'm sure you'll talk about that in a couple of minutes with non-muscle invasive disease. Enfortumab is a newer class of chemo. So kind of old school chemotherapy with a new delivery system. I think of it like a smart bomb of chemotherapy directing treatment to the cancer and then sparing normal tissues. When you put those two drugs together, the response rate that we're seeing is higher than we've ever seen with another combination. Um, and these responses can be durable, meaning that we can see complete responses that can last for months or years, even in the absence of ongoing therapy. I don't know if we could have predicted that that would have been a reality that we were living in 10 years ago. And then because of that, a lot of their paradigms have kind of changed. And I think like some of the clinical trial questions that we're asking are shifting to think about, how do we how do we um, how do we use that regimen the best? How do we understand it better? Maybe modification of toxicity. And if it turns out to be not the right treatment for the person in front of us, how do we manage the next steps? So that's what I think about when one of the things I think about every day when I come to work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think back, I was having a conversation, I think this is about the Institute a couple months ago with people about how the conversation with our patients has changed dramatically in the last, even the last 6, 7 years. The beginning of my career, we had platinum therapy for our metastatic, and I'll kind of start this by let's start in the metastatic, and we'll kind of move towards kind of muscle invasive and earlier as we go in the conversation. But in the metastatic setting, we had platinum-based chemotherapy, and that was kind of it. We would have conversations about we're going to start on this. There's a small group of patients that may get a complete response and be cured. And if your disease comes back, we'll try, another chemotherapy, like a paclitaxel or something like that. Um, but we didn't have much more to offer, and it was a very somber, clinic a lot of times. Um, and we've talked on this particular venue a couple years ago about the EV-302 trial, which was the enfortumab pembrolizumab in metastatic urothelial cancer, and how that really shifted the bar and became the standard of care. Um, Tell me a little bit about your conversations that you have with a patient who comes to you today with sort of, let's just say, new metastatic urothelial cancer, not heavily pretreated, um, about the conversation you have with them, but also about clinical trials, like in the metastatic setting. Um, when, where, what type, what types of trials are you seeing, now that we have sort of a new sort of standard? Um, what's that conversation like for you and your patients in clinic today?
Sure. I mean, currently at Hopkins, and this may change in the next couple of months, but when it comes to um, patients that have metastatic urothelial cancer, we don't have a trial in the space where, we're talking about enfortumab and pembro as the standard of care versus something else. Again, that may change in the next few months, but um, oftentimes we're talking about just getting that started. And at the same time, part of our standard practice is obtaining, not just pathology information to be clear that we're treating the right patient, the right disease at the right time, but getting something called next generation sequencing that tells us about changes or mutations that a cancer has. It may help us target the cancer, understand the biology a bit better, and then in a more sophisticated manner choose a next line therapy should enfortumab and pembrolizumab not control disease as we expect, or maybe a patient is having toxicity that leads us to hold the therapy or discontinue it, and then the cancer, may grow through that pause. So I think, when you and I are seeing patients and talking about what we're going to do first, I think in the back of our minds as oncologists, we're also anticipating, and then what am I going to do next?
Hmm.
If, what I'm hoping for maybe doesn't come to pass. Like we're always thinking about that next step. And that's how we prepare for that next step, is to really understand the biology of the cancer. So we can decide if we need to use something else, what might that be? And from a clinical trial perspective, I think of clinical trials just as a way to expand my clinical toolkit. The drugs that we have in our armamentarium that are FDA approved, as well as local therapies like surgery and radiation. I just think of them like mental tools. And when we have trials available based on biology of tumor, or maybe based on what we call line of therapy, again, it's just, how can I make that toolkit bigger? How can I expand my bench of options that I can present to a patient? Um, I think we're always thinking about trials. When, we talk about starting frontline therapy, I do bring up the conversation, especially because I think people are asking, folks often are coming to Hopkins because they're looking for that next best therapy that may be down, maybe around the corner, um, about are there trial options now, or what does that look like in the future? Um, if we're starting somebody on the standard enfortumab and pembrolizumab, that doesn't necessarily mean that if they need another therapy down the line, that they wouldn't be a trial candidate. So every time we're moving from kind of like one um, um, regimen to another, one drug to another, one what we call disease state to another. That's like a separate opportunity to think about clinical trials. So it can be an ongoing conversation, even in the setting of starting one therapy and then thinking about the next. Sorry, that was a lot of answer.
No, no, I
Hopefully,
think
I
it's
got to the
good.
point that you were
I
thinking of.
I think it sort of points to a little bit of some of the complexity of how fast some of our prior sort of um, trials were designed and how they're moving very quickly. So, I mean, I would say kind of for the audience, like what we've learned from clinical trials in the last 2 years, things that have changed. So the enfortumab and pembrolizumab combination, also sometimes known as PAD7 Keytruda, in different settings, um, it beat standard platinum chemotherapy head to head in metastatic patients. And so it moved into the new standard for frontline metastatic disease. We also, in the metastatic disease, saw that for patients with activating alterations of the FGFR gene in their tumor, which is about 15% of patients in the metastatic setting, that beat the older kind of second, third line chemotherapy, the single agent drugs with some of the taxane like paclitaxel, docetaxel in a randomized trial. So that actually demonstrated, okay, if we're into that second line setting, we need to think about that for patients with those mutations. And then we've also had, some other drugs approved across all cancers. So there is a group of our patients that have overexpression of a protein on the surface of the cancer cell called HER2. Um, that there was a trial done that looked at patients with all types of cancers with HER2 overexpression and demonstrated, clinically relevant tumor responses in those patients. And so now we have that in our medicine cabinet. We don't quite know exactly where and what order, to sequence that. And then we still have platinum therapy. And then there's also sort of this gray zone about kind of where does the drug sacituzumab that was approved and then sort of was pulled out from the label, but is still available sometimes from insurance. And there are certainly a whole number of clinical trials that are still investigating the target of sacituzumab, which is a protein called TROP2. Um, that may alter that as well. And then if that's not enough, if that's not enough, you throw this explosion of sort of a new tumor state called sort of molecular residual disease or minimal residual disease that is defined by circulating tumor DNA in the bloodstream. And then there's also some expansion into the urine for earlier stages, not quite as far ahead, which you've done a lot of work in, looking at that. So, uh, it seems to me that we had a pause as kind of everybody was resetting what are those expectations with the new enfortumab pembrolizumab. And just again to reinforce to the audience, that trial took what was previously a median or average, I call it, it's not exactly the same thing statistically, but a median overall survival of about 16 months with traditional platinum therapy in metastatic patients, and it nearly doubled it, moved it to about 31 months. And once we get into that range, you start getting into ranges where using overall survival as a primary endpoint becomes challenging because you then have to do a trial that is probably going to take 6, 7 years to finish. So now I think, and you may comment on this as well, but I think what we're now starting to see is sort of as the field is kind of reset, waking up and kind of seeing where are those opportunities. I think we're starting to see a lot of trials that are trying to figure out how to incorporate the ctDNA. Like, is that an actual defined population and an endpoint that we should change therapy? Should we just follow it now and then learn and decide later? We're also seeing a lot of trials, I think, that are trying to define what is the new second line. Like, what do we do after enfortumab pembrolizumab? Is it platinum therapy? Is it a HER2? Is it an FGFR? Is it a combination? So I don't know if you might be able to comment maybe a little bit about what you're seeing in the clinical trial kind of landscape and the offerings for our patients that you're seeing now, but also that you expect maybe in the next year or two.
Sure. You know, I want to back up for a second, just comment on the impact of enfortumab and pembrolizumab. You talked about the doubling of expected overall survival. It's not just that we're improving outcomes compared to kind of what we've seen before, but the number of patients that we can treat now compared to who we could treat before probably even doubled. So, again, 10 years ago, part of our workflow every day, if people can believe this or not, was walking into a room, looking at a chart, and then deciding yes or no, can someone get cisplatin or not? And then every other decision we made was kind of predicated on that. Our guidelines were written, can you yes or no get cisplatin in the advanced setting? And that's changed, right? Because enfortumab and pembrolizumab is tolerable for a much wider group of patients. It's metabolized by the liver and not by the kidneys, and much less toxic. And so not only the outcomes better, but they're better for patients that otherwise we really would not have been treating with cisplatin-based chemotherapy. And so again, that's really changed the landscape. Um, you mentioned, there's a drug called trastuzumab deruxtecan or in HER2, the one that's FDA approved if the tumor has
Mhm.
this HER2, on the surface. That's kind of interesting because sometimes we're hearing about drugs going through the pipeline, for years and years and years, just to get their first FDA approval in urothelial cancer. That one was kind of taking a drug that's already been approved for a completely different indication, a really well-designed clinical trial looking at for any kind of cancer, if you have this, expression on
Mhm.
the surface of the cell, um, using it in a clinical trial setting, and then, that was a positive trial. It was like a light switch flipped, right? It wasn't like we had to wait, months for distribution and things like that. Drugs already on formulary, and now we can
Mhm.
use it. So I love that trial design and how efficient it is and how practical it was. And hopefully we can see more of that because that makes sense, and it helps us get drugs to patients quicker. Um, I forgot your question, but you're asking about kind of
Oh no,
what
it
we
was
see
just
in
kind of
clinic,
the,
what we see
are
in
you
clinic.
the types of like trials that you're seeing now,
Yeah,
uh, they are incorporating ctDNA in different
yeah,
populations and
yeah.
that we're seeing more offerings now than I think we saw before.
Yeah, and I think we should probably maybe kind of flesh out because some people may have heard of ctDNA or even have it drawn, and some people may not have. So when you and I are talking about ctDNA, I think we're talking about a specific kind of what's called a tumor-informed circulating tumor DNA value, and the way that that gets generated is, say someone is had a TURBT, had the biopsy done prior, to seeing near you. It's done by one of our urologists, has a diagnosis of like a new muscle invasive bladder cancer. Well, we may then request or order a ctDNA. The way that that gets done is that some of this tumor tissue gets sent out to a third party vendor that kind of specializes in generating this information. And based on the changes in the mutation that the tumor has, um, what's called a probe is generated. And we're essentially looking for those same changes or mutations in the bloodstream that you can get just with a blood test, and then quantifying that. So that first blood draw and the information to quantify whether or not there is or is not a circulating tumor in the bloodstream, it takes a couple of weeks to get that information back. But then once we have it, and if it then correlates with what we see on CT scans or what Dr. Cates or Dr. Smith might see on TURBT, it becomes really powerful because different than or in addition to a CAT scan, it can be done more frequently, and then we can get a sense of during the course of treatment. You would expect if that number starts out detectable, that during pre-operative chemo and immunotherapy, which is now our standard, that number will go down with time. And that following surgery, you would expect that number to be zero. So we have trials built around outcomes that look like, well, what if that number isn't zero after preoperative treatment and surgery? What would be the next step? So that's, I think, again, really interesting trial that does two things. It helps us treat patients with the highest risk of recurrence. So kind of helps us understand who those patients are. If their ctDNA is positive after surgery, we expect it to be negative. And then it also helps us in potentially overtreating patients that maybe their cancer wasn't destined to recur. That's what's called the modern trial that we have open at Hopkins.
Yeah, I think that's a really good segue to talk about kind of clinical trials in the last year around that space of patients with muscle invasive disease who are traditionally looking at needing to have cystectomy. Maybe they got chemo before, maybe they didn't. But we've had two trials in the last year that have read out as positive, which is the first time we've had that in a while, in a neoadjuvant setting and then even adjuvant. I'm speaking specifically of first is the Niagara trial, looking at neoadjuvant cisplatin gemcitabine and the immunotherapy durvalumab compared to traditional chemotherapy. And then there was immunotherapy on the backside, which you can speak about a little bit. And then the IMvigor011 trial, which was asking specifically on the backside of surgery in patients with detectable ctDNA in their bloodstream, who we knew from prior studies were at the highest risk for recurrence, that showed a benefit for the immune therapy atezolizumab by itself. So I wonder if maybe you kind of talk about those particular trials and how that's sort of changed your practice and approach to kind of patients around surgery. And then also, you mentioned the modern trial, which I think is picking up on that, um, asking a more specific question about, do we need to intensify therapy even more in the high risk? And can we actually safely kind of de-escalate therapy in those who are at the lowest risk?
Sure. So the Niagara approach, which is using traditional standard chemotherapy that we've been talking about, cisplatin, gemcitabine chemotherapy, that's been a long time standard in the metastatic setting as well as a preoperative chemotherapy, combining it with an immunotherapy drug called durvalumab, and then using that prior to surgery. That's for 4 cycles. So the drugs are given 3 drugs on day 1 drug on day 8, and day 15 is off with a plan for 4 preoperative cycles. And then a pause to get follow-up scans, and then has patient in surgery, and then to give immunotherapy in the postoperative setting. Um, Putting immunotherapy plus chemotherapy together is a paradigm that we've been doing both in urothelial cancer in the metastatic setting, as well as in other types of solid tumors like lung cancer for some time. So we felt like this was going to be safe. But the question was, in a large scale clinical trial, does adding durvalumab and the potential risk that it would also add, because a third medication is going to have its own set of side effects, does it improve outcomes? And the answer is yes. So doing that paradigm of adding immunotherapy to chemotherapy prior to surgery and then continuing it post-op for a year, it does improve outcomes. So we're looking at long-term in terms of survival outcomes. I think the other thing that was really interesting about that study was, you know, we have an early look at the time of surgery as to whether or not chemotherapy and immunotherapy melted the tumor away. Do we have no evidence of cancer, which is really good news at the time of surgery? Or do we have tumor that's lived through chemotherapy and maybe into lymph nodes? That's less good news, and we worry more about the risk of recurrence. Um, it seemed like almost like the character of that complete response that we would see on that trial with that combination seemed to be better than just chemotherapy alone. So that has become our new standard of care. When that trial read out as positive and then went through FDA approval processes, and guideline endorsed, we've been doing that at Hopkins for some time now. So uh, that's just an anticipated outcome of when a really well designed large scale clinical trial, called a phase 3 trial, that's done not just in the US, but across the world, um, gives us the answer that we were hoping for. It means that both from a perspective of, does it improve long-term outcomes, including survival, and does the increased cost of the drugs as well as the potential toxicity, is that balance with the outcome that you're expecting? So that was a change in the last year.
Yep.
You also mentioned about some of the information that we have about some of our postoperative trials. So those trials were designed prior to when we were using immunotherapy in the pre-op setting. So for patients who had moved through preoperative chemotherapy and then either had bladder surgery or kidney surgery for upper tract urothelial cancer, if they either weren't chemotherapy candidates or had chemotherapy with tumors that lived through treatment, making them a high risk of recurrence, then there were 3 different trials that were done. 2 were positive and 1 was essentially negative, that showed adding immunotherapy for a year, again, improved outcomes, decreased the risk of the cancer coming back. And if it were to come back, it would delay that time. So those were important trials, and using immunotherapy in the post-op setting became the standard of care. I think that the negative trial is a great lesson, I think, for all of us in terms of thinking about clinical trials and thinking about science. The trial was negative, meaning that we all expected that the immunotherapy called atezolizumab would also do the same as the other two immunotherapies. It would improve outcomes. And it didn't. And whether or not that's a trial design or patient selection, we weren't really sure. But importantly, even though that trial was negative, I think it's really important and responsible to try and understand as much as you can about the information that's generated in the clinical trial. So, as part of that trial, there was this blood test done, circulating tumor DNA. And lo and behold, the patients with the highest risk of recurrence, those with the ctDNA that was positive, and they got the immunotherapy drug called atezolizumab, their outcomes were better. And so a second clinical trial was done based on that really important information. And that's the one that's now positive, that shows if ctDNA is positive post surgery and you get atezolizumab, this trial looks positive. And so we anticipate getting more information about what that trial looks like, what that data looks like in the coming months.
Yep. I think it's just an incredibly rapid and changing landscape. But I think most of this that we've seen has been for positive, in terms of, improved outcomes. So these are really good challenges to have. I don't call them problems, I call them challenges. But I'm getting a message from the sky, phone a friend from Stephanie Cooper Greenberg, um, asking, she has a basic question. So I don't know if our AV people can help us to let her in just at the moment right now. Is that possible in the background? Oh, I see you, Stephanie.
Hi, friends.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for this. My head is spinning because my own husband had a bladder cancer journey, as you know, and started in 2012. And at the time, guess what? There were no trials and there was no therapy like to speak of. There was just kind of nothing, which was the whole point of saying, can we do more? And now it's just sort of an explosion. I don't mean to ask such really dial it back a little bit. From a patient perspective, this is a lot. And what's so exciting is there's so many trials, which it's almost like a fire hose of trials that didn't really exist before. And also drugs and standards of care have changed. It's really remarkable that this is it's never a good time to have bladder or upper tract cancer, but at the same time, the progress has been really pretty stunning. So I want to dial it back from a patient standpoint, that maybe a patient who is in a rural or community hospital setting who's not at Hopkins, and just sort of walk us through how would they, with all the things, fancy things they're talking about, like sequencing and ctDNA and all this stuff, how would someone learn whether a trial is for them? Do they rely on their physician? Do they search themselves? That's my first question, and I have many more. From a patient journey, and you have such amazing information and care and wisdom to impart to them, and hopefully many others do. Where do you start with a clinical
Yeah.
trial when you are a patient and you're kind of on your own? First
Yeah,
question.
I think that's a great question. And I think it's become even harder to kind of know the right answer. But what I would say is, number one, um, we're a resource for you. So we mentioned, at the beginning, the email address bladdercancer@jhmi.edu. If there's questions, just send them in. But what I would say about clinical trials is I think it's very important, I think, for patients and families that if they think that they would ever, consider or want to think about a clinical trial, that it's really in your best interest to ask about that up front. And I would say go, to centers, other centers that have clinical trials, like a wide array of clinical trials, and simply set up a second opinion consultation. And I
Mhm.
say that not because necessarily you might not be at the point that you need a clinical trial, or maybe your mindset is, I really like to get standard therapy at home first or something like that, which is certainly understandable. But one of the hardest things I think for patients and families is just getting into, some of these larger medical centers that have an array of clinical trial options available. And that's not to say many practices have clinical trials locally. So certainly ask. Your local oncologist should be your advocate. And a lot of times they have clinical trials locally that they can treat. But I think It's like building a network. And I will tell you from someone from at Johns Hopkins and having been at other centers that we do those kind of consultations all the time. And we take no offense at all if a patient comes, and says, thanks, but no thanks. You've really helped me in my journey. If I need you again, you're a phone call away. And honestly, that is the truth. Once you're in the system, might go back away for 9 months, 12 months doing fine, and then the disease comes back. And that's the time when you kind of things are sort of happening fast. You kind of need to be seen. If you're already established, within a medical system, that really helps. So I don't know, Jeannie, if other perspectives you might have on that particular question.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that, as I was talking about earlier, we tend to just like to prepare, and so, part of an opinion is, it takes sometimes a few weeks too long, like to come in and to see one of us. But it's not just the in-person visit, it's the pathology. It's, the slides coming over and our team doing that second opinion and getting that firm confirmation of, do you have that rare histology? And now we have that record. So it's kind of like getting everything lined up. So instead of trying to, quick get a new patient appointment, it's a follow-up. And that, we have doctors from all over the place sending us messages of, hey, your patient that you saw 2 years ago, we have questions about, do you have a clinical trial? Yeah, we field those emails all the time. So yeah, agree 100%.
And then a patient has to sort of qualify. Does that mean like biologically qualify in some cases, or are there other qualifications, age, other comorbidities, things like that? Or is it basic question, is it really hard to get into a trial? Or
Yeah.
and what,
Yeah.
like, is it, phone books full of paperwork that are just consent forms and annoying, or is there some ease in the process now that there's so many and it seems like there's such a robust effort to have more clinical trials, which have been a net positive? What are some of the barriers for um, patients, whether they're in an academic medical center or not? And I have
Yeah.
a question to that too. So,
No, it's a great question. So if Noah or I meet a new patient and feel like we have everything that we need and we're ready to initiate treatment, we place an order, and usually 7 to 10 days later, if we feel like, we want to start, or even sooner, with insurance approval, we can get started. If someone's going on a clinical trial, that timeline may be 4 weeks, maybe a little bit longer than that, because of all of the checklists and kind of outside just the physician in charge of the patient's care, the things that we need to do. So depending on the study, the ease or the difficulty, it can be different. The flavor of these trials, there's in the big picture, there's phase 1 clinical trials, there's phase 2 clinical trials, and there's phase 3 clinical trials. Noah mentioned EV302. That was the one that compared enfortumab and pembro to cisplatin and gemcitabine. The bigger the trial is, depending, sometimes a little bit easier to get on compared to phase 1 trials. Those tend to be newer drugs that aren't FDA approved, or FDA approved drugs in combinations that haven't yet been seen together, but oftentimes looking for something called maximum tolerated dose, or how much of the medication can be given to a patient safely. Those trials, I think of them sometimes like um, loading roller coaster cars. Kind of, you let the first three go and you make sure that they come back safely, and then you let another three cars go and you make sure they come back safely. So those trials are a little bit harder to get on, just because the slots, the airplane seats for them are smaller. Whereas the larger clinical trials, there's a lot more airplane seats. But all trials are going to have, it's called eligibility criteria. And that is a checklist that, even if Noah or I really wanted our patient on, we have to be absolutely adherent to that checklist to make sure that liver function is okay, kidney function is okay, something we call functional status, your get up and go. Can you get yourself in and out of the shower, up and down steps, those kinds of things. So depending on the study, there are stipulations that we just have to be we have to be compliant with.
Mhm.
Next question. I've always wanted to ask this, who pays for the clinical trial and the drugs? Or is it free for a patient? I mean, they're part of a discovery enterprise. Do their insurance companies have to pay for it, or do the drug companies who are supplying the drugs and
Yeah.
the medical enterprises who are part of these uh, clinical trial consortiums, are they assuming the cost? There has to be a cost here somehow. And
Yeah.
how does that work?
So it's sort of a mix. Typically, if it's a new drug that's being looked at, the pharmaceutical company will typically pay for any procedures, tests, or interventions that are not part of the standard, approach or care for that cancer. Um, but what that does not mean is it does not mean that participating in a clinical trial is free, in terms of out-of-pocket cost. What it often means to patients is that, let's say we were going to give you, chemotherapy, and standard chemotherapy would involve us testing your lab work, once a week to look at your kidney function, your blood counts, that kind of thing. Um, those costs would still be billed to your insurance, just
Mhm.
like they would in any other, care. And so for standard costs, labs, CAT scans at standard intervals, patients will still get a copay just like they would be if they were not in a trial. Um, so if a trial is literally, a first in human brand new drug, that is very, very early, then almost everything will actually be paid for by the company. But if it's a little bit later, then to the patient's view, often it will look like almost like standard care, standard kind of copay costs.
A question I have too, and thank you for this. I'm just sort of dialing it down here. For the patients that you've had on trials, how is that experience for them? Are they excited, fearful, anxious, and can you drop out of a trial if things aren't going well? What's that human experience that you hear about? Just in case anyone
Mhm.
listening is intrigued by a clinical trial. And the next question is about what percentage of patients with bladder cancer enroll in clinical trials? Is it quite small overall? Any idea of what that number is? So the patient experience, and then what's the big picture of how many do enroll in clinical trials?
Jeannie, you want to take that one?
Sure. I'll take the second one first. I think we
Yeah.
all feel like the percentage enrollment in clinical trials is too low in general.
See.
Um, yeah, and sometimes that's just the distance to a major cancer center and a patient can't do it, or there's an eligibility criteria that we can't overcome. A lot of our male patients at the time of surgery get diagnosed and cured from prostate cancer. And then we may have a clinical trial that says you can't have a second cancer in the last 2 years. Well, sometimes it's just written in stone and we can't overcome that, even though we don't think that that's a life limiting problem. So, not enough. From the patient perspective, Stephanie, I think we now have a new great idea, which is next time we do this, we should have a patient speaker.
100%.
Yeah,
We, we,
yeah.
there is a patient we know, he may be on, but I'll share this with you. He reached out to us at GBCI years ago, in a different state, and he was intrigued by a trial. He didn't know if he should do it. He reached out to us, you clinicians, and me, and I said, "Well, give it a try. And like, what have you got to lose? I mean, it's an effort. He had to drive. He had to show up." And it was a very novel therapy. It was the 007 trial, and it really worked. And
Mhm.
he's so thrilled because he just maybe wasn't anticipating like a complete response, but this was a trial out of Moffitt.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of telling his story, but I think his view was he tried everything, 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 and he was open and game to just do what it took. This one last trial, this was his last hope before maybe he had to face the idea of a surgery. And I'll be darned, it worked. And he's, spoken about it and that this was a really
Yeah.
remarkable experience, but he didn't go into it thinking that this would be like the cure. And that's a loaded word, and we don't like to use that too much. But it was a big decision for him to say, one more, should I do this? What's the opportunity cost of doing it versus maybe
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
disease progressing? I mean, it was very stressful for
Hey,
him.
and every trial is different, in terms of their schedules and sort of what that means to, a patient's quality of life in terms of what they go through. Some are very intense, some are no more than the standard of care in terms of the same, timing. To answer one of the questions that you asked a little bit earlier, can a patient, withdraw from a clinical trial? Yeah, absolutely. They can do that anytime. Um, we always like for them to stay in the trial because the more information we have on how they're doing helps us understand not only how they're doing, but how that particular treatment does. But nobody can keep somebody in a trial. If
Mhm.
somebody changes their mind, they're free to withdraw from the trial at any time.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's I say, every step of the entire treatment journey, is an individual decision every time that we go through that.
So patients benefit from clinical trials, even though you don't have to be in one.
Mhm.
Um, and can you address the fascinating mechanism where how does a trial get made? I know that there are cooperative groups, and I happen to sit on, there's a National Cancer Institute has a bladder cancer task force where they review concepts for trials. They're getting quite fancy now, a lot of comparison trials and really complicated word plays on non-inferior, a double, triple, quadruple negative, and using cocktails of immunotherapy drugs. Really fascinating. I am not a scientist, but in-depth discussion about how a trial comes to be. Noah, can you sort of explain, like, just for us simpletons here, how
Yeah.
does a trial come to be that is sponsored, I suppose, by the National Cancer Institute? What is that process, and how long does it take, usually, the sort of runway for it?
Well, I'll answer a little bit in two ways, but most clinical trials are usually looking at a therapeutic intervention, or in some cases, maybe a new diagnostic test to guide therapy. Sometimes imaging, but it's usually one of those two. And I would say in the vast majority of cases, most of those therapeutic interventions or diagnostic tests are typically coming from commercial companies. They're typically coming from the pharmaceutical industry or other for-profit companies.
Mhm.
Now, they don't get to be discovered or developed by, a company without sort of the work that's done up front. So I would say it typically starts with science. Maybe it's a discovery that happens in a lab at Hopkins or some other lab across the world where somebody makes an observation, um, and they publish the first paper. They may not even actually understand the significance, of, taking that finding and thinking about how that could become a drug. I think back about that Schoolhouse Rock, how does something become a bill back in the 70s? But it's sort of like that. How does something become a drug or a test? Somebody has to recognize the value of it, not just the financial value, but the actual value, like how could this benefit patients? And so I think companies have a well-oiled way of sort of analyzing that in terms of like eventually, does it have the potential for them to actually make money as a company while helping patients? Okay, so that's how the typical trials come about. Now there's investigators like myself, Dr. Hoffman-Censits, many of our colleagues, collaborators, urology, medical oncology, that help them in that process. They may come to us and ask us to serve on an advisory board or a steering committee. So it's not done in a vacuum. Um, the other trials that you mentioned, like the National Cancer Institute, those are sometimes a little bit different because the National Cancer Institute funds research, and you can kind of think of each clinical trial that's done through the National Cancer Institute network almost like a grant, because that's really what it is. Um, and those sometimes have the ability to answer questions that are incredibly important to our patients that may or may not have any profit angle,
I
but
see.
really we need to understand. Um, So an example of that, for instance, is a trial that we don't know the results yet, but our friend and colleague and co-director Max Cates led through the National Cancer Institute was a trial that was comparing standard BCG treatment for early stage bladder cancer to a chemotherapy installation, gemcitabine docetaxel. And it was just trying to show that the gemcitabine docetaxel was no worse than BCG. And the reason that trial was done was because of the BCG shortage that we're still facing. And so the value would be to bring a therapy that we can actually get and help patients that way. So those kind of trials can happen, I think, through the National Cancer Institute. So um, starts with science, needs an idea, and needs someone to sort of be an advocate to kind of work its way through. Yeah.
Fantastic. Great. Well, um, my last question, do all tumor for when a patient presents with non-muscle invasive or muscle invasives, you mentioned, all these science and the biology of the tumor. Are all tumors sequenced now pretty much, or how do you know if someone has this certain subtype, this certain type of bladder cancer or upper tract that would benefit
Yeah.
from a trial? What's
Yeah.
that new layer of technology and knowledge in
Yeah.
the paradigm?
I would say that the number of tumors being sequenced has continued to increase kind of with each year, but it's not all. It's not all. And I say that because sometimes there's not enough tumor to sequence.
Oh,
Sometimes it's very
interesting.
small. It's
Hmm.
just technically not possible. And then sometimes, patients and families may be in a situation where that information would not actually change, the treatment options or choices. In some ways might actually complicate it by introducing, well, why don't I do that? Well, actually, because that therapy is too toxic or something, to that effect. Um, so it's not all, but I would say that it is now in our guidelines, to actually, if possible, to try to get that information because we now have drugs that are approved, based on them. So yeah,
The drugs that have been approved went through to take
clinical trials.
they
Yep,
went through clinical trials. The trials had some benefit, and the drugs were able then to be approved and now are
yep,
standard of care. So the trials in the long run improve this, add to the standard of care options for patients. You can have more tools in the toolbox. That's how this whole thing works.
absolutely.
And if someone in a clinical trial is actually doing an amazing public service, when you really, so thank you all who
Yeah.
are listening, who are either intrigued by or have participated in. And then thank you to you and Jeannie and your team and all the academic scientists and people who care about this across the country. Because again, I hark back to 2012. It wasn't that long ago. There was nothing. I mean, there was no. It's just like this is it. This is all we can
Yeah.
offer you. Door A or B or C. Now it's like unlimited. So I'm not closing this program, but I just am
No, it's all right. We need to wrap it up a little bit, but yeah.
how grateful
Mhm.
I am. And one teeny tiny last question. In a time of not a political question, with some austerity and grants and grant making and NIH funding, are clinical trials going to stick around are they immune from sort of the idea that there will be some cutbacks and cuts or slowing down of grants? Are they sort of on their own in their own ecosystem and universe because it's working with the drug companies?
Yeah, Jeannie, what do you think on that? I can offer some thoughts, but I want to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think the answer is no, unfortunately, Stephanie. I mean, I think there's so many changes and the rules of engagement that academic centers have been under for a long time are kind of shifting underneath us without really kind of understanding or expectation. All cancer centers are kind of dealing with that. I think um, but we remain hopeful and super mission focused and we are people who work in adversity and um, try and be productive and creative when unexpected things are kind of thrown our way. So I think we have a skill set to hopefully continue to make good things happen for our patients. So we're mission focused and dedicated to this.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I would just say it's times are kind of uncertain. And I think industry, the pharmaceutical companies will continue to do clinical trials. I think where we sometimes are impacted at our medical centers is that a lot of our staff sometimes are supported by some of the core grants that are associated with some of the National Cancer Institute and things. And so that can go up and down a little bit. But as Jeannie mentioned, uh, we're not going to stop doing trials. We've got to get creative in terms of finding new funding sources, that kind of thing. But I definitely don't see them coming to a halt. I think they make it a little more creative in terms of how we conduct them. Yeah.
Beautiful answer. No, it's all yours. I have no more
Yeah.
questions. And thank you, everybody, for
No.
tuning
So
in.
it's my pleasure. Like I said, it's always a pleasure to speak to our audience, and I want to thank everyone who joined us today. We do look forward to seeing everyone again in October 14th at 4 p.m. for our next session of Grand Rounds, and that will be to discuss managing chemo-induced neuropathy with Michaela Olson, who is our clinical program director for oncology and has some very unique expertise in sort of the care of that often difficult to deal with issue of neuropathy from the treatments. So thanks everyone for joining us. And as I mentioned, we're here for you and look forward to seeing more of you in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.